24 hours after I buried my husband, my mother-in-law dragged my suitcase across the porch and threw it into the mud, while I stood there holding our 2-month-old daughter in my arms. "Now that Sawyer is gone," she said, "you and that baby have nothing left." I didn't argue. I didn't cry in front of her. I held my daughter closer, picked up what fell out of that suitcase, and walked away without saying a single word. 6 months later, she would give anything to take that sentence back. My name is Ren Castellan, and this is my story. I met Sawyer Pemberton on a Tuesday in October, 3 years before any of this happened. I was a physical therapist working out of a small clinic in Charleston, South Carolina, and he'd come in with a shoulder injury from sailing. He made terrible jokes. He asked me to dinner before his second appointment was even over. I said yes because he laughed like nothing in the world could touch him. What I didn't know yet was that Sawyer came from the Pembertons, the family behind Pemberton Shipping Group, a freight and logistics company that had moved cargo along the eastern seaboard for 4 generations. Old money. Older opinions. His mother, Rosalind Thorne, had kept her maiden name professionally long before she married into the family, and she ran the Pemberton Foundation with the kind of precision most people reserve for surgery. His sister, Sabrina Pemberton, sat on the board and treated the company checkbook like a personal allowance. His father, Ambrose Pemberton, was the quiet one, the one who watched everything and said almost nothing, which I would later understand was its own kind of danger. When Sawyer told his family we were getting married, Rosalind didn't yell. She was too controlled for that. She simply asked me to sign a prenuptial agreement 3 days before the wedding, drafted by the family's own attorneys, with language I barely understood at the time. Sawyer apologized for it. I signed anyway, because I wasn't marrying a contract. I was marrying him. 2 years into our marriage, we found out I was pregnant. Sawyer cried in the car outside the doctor's office, then laughed at himself for crying, then cried again. He wanted to tell his family in person, at Sunday dinner, the way he thought a happy family would. Rosalind's response was to ask what this would mean for the trust structure. Sabrina asked whether I'd be keeping my figure. Ambrose was the only one who reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Our daughter was born on a Sunday morning in March. We named her Briar. Sawyer held her for 6 hours straight in the hospital before a nurse finally convinced him to let someone else take a turn. For 2 months, our apartment smelled like formula and fabric softener, and Sawyer came home every night still in his work clothes just to rock her to sleep before dinner. He used to tell me, half joking, that Briar was the only Pemberton who'd never once looked at me like I was something to be managed. He never got the chance to watch her grow up. Sawyer collapsed at his desk on a Thursday afternoon. An undiagnosed heart condition, the doctor said later, something that had been building quietly for years without a single symptom to warn us. He was 34. I held his hand in a hospital hallway in Charleston while machines beeped in a rhythm that eventually just stopped, Briar asleep against my chest the entire time in a carrier I hadn't thought to take off. I don't remember most of the funeral. I remember Rosalind in black, dry-eyed, greeting guests like she was hosting a fundraiser. I remember Sabrina recording video for the foundation's social media in the middle of the reception. I remember Ambrose standing at the edge of the room, watching Briar and me the way you'd watch something fragile you weren't sure how to hold. The next morning, I was still in the guest house on the Pemberton estate, trying to get Briar to settle after a night neither of us had really slept through, when Rosalind knocked on my door. She didn't wait for me to answer. "You'll want to be packed by noon," she said. I thought she meant I should prepare to travel back to our apartment. I was wrong. By 11, my suitcase was sitting outside on the stone porch. By 11:15, Rosalind had dragged it down the steps herself, her heels clicking against wet stone, and let it fall into the mud at the bottom. I stood there with Briar wrapped against my chest, watching my belongings scatter across the wet grass. It burst open on impact. My clothes. My work badge. A framed photo of Sawyer and me on our wedding day, the glass cracking against a rock. "Get your things off this property," she said, glancing at Briar without a trace of softness in her expression. Sawyer is gone. That means whatever claim you and that child thought you had is gone with him. Sabrina stood behind her, phone raised, recording every second of it with a small, satisfied smile. This should really be on the foundation page, she said. Everyone should see what happens when someone marries into a family they were never really part of. I stood in the mud in the same dress I'd worn to bury my husband, one hand cupped protectively around Briar's head, and I said nothing. I bent down as carefully as I could with her still against me. I picked up the photo, wiped the mud off the glass with my sleeve, and held it against my chest, right beside my daughter. Rosalind watched me, waiting for tears, waiting for a scene she could post about. "You're right," I told her quietly. "We have nothing." I turned and walked down that long gravel driveway in the rain, Briar tucked safely under my coat, leaving the rest of my belongings scattered behind me. I didn't look back once. What none of them knew was that my daughter and I weren't walking away with nothing at all. 3 weeks before he passed, Sawyer had asked me to meet him at a law office downtown, not the family's firm, a different one entirely, one his family had never heard of. He didn't explain much that day, only that he wanted to make sure the two of you are protected no matter what, and I assumed it was standard paperwork. Updating a beneficiary. Nothing more. I was wrong about that too. 2 weeks after the funeral, once the initial shock had thinned out just enough for me to function, I received a call from an attorney named Priya Okonkwo-Reyes at Caldwell Marsh Attorneys in Charleston. She asked me to come in, with Briar if I needed to. She said it was about Sawyer's estate. I sat across from her in a glass conference room, Briar asleep in her car seat beside me, still wearing the same numb expression I'd worn since the funeral, and she slid a folder across the table. Sawyer had transferred his shares in Pemberton Shipping Group into a private trust 6 weeks before he died. Voting shares, executive authority, and controlling interest, all directed to me, with a secondary provision naming Briar as the trust's ultimate beneficiary once she came of age. Not a public announcement. Not something filed where Rosalind or Sabrina would think to look, because he'd used a separate holding entity his own father didn't know existed. He'd known his family long enough to understand that if they found out while he was alive, they'd have fought him on it in front of a judge before the ink dried. He'd told his attorney exactly why he was doing it. "My wife is the only person in this family who never once asked me for anything, and my daughter deserves to inherit something better than the way they treat people." For 6 months after that meeting, while Rosalind told anyone who'd listen that I'd disappeared back to wherever I came from, I wasn't disappearing. I was in that same glass conference room every Tuesday morning, Briar napping in a portable bassinet in the corner, working through shipping contracts, audited financial statements, and executive compensation records with Priya beside me. I read through years of expense reports between feedings and diaper changes. I found the pattern I hadn't been looking for: repeated transfers out of a subsidiary account into a private venture Sabrina had started under a different name, one that had never once turned a profit and never once been reported to the board. Grief doesn't disappear when you're raising a 2-month-old alone. It just changes shape. Mine turned into discipline. The Pemberton Foundation Gala took place every October at a hotel ballroom overlooking Charleston Harbor. It was the family's biggest night of the year. Donors in evening wear, a local news crew by the entrance, Rosalind at the center of it all like she'd built the room herself. I hadn't been invited. I didn't need to be. As majority shareholder and now acting director of Pemberton Shipping Group, I had every legal right to walk through those doors, and Priya had made certain of it in writing weeks in advance. Briar stayed home that night with a sitter I trusted completely, tucked into bed with the nightlight Sawyer had picked out for her nursery. The car dropped me at the entrance just after 8. I wore a deep green gown Sawyer had once told me matched my eyes, and around my neck sat a sapphire pendant from the Pemberton family vault, one Rosalind had told me years earlier I would never be elegant enough to wear. Conversations slowed as I walked in. A few phones lifted, then lowered. Rosalind saw me first, near the champagne table, and her expression went rigid for just a moment before she rebuilt it into something colder. "What exactly are you doing here?" she said, keeping her voice low enough that the nearest guests wouldn't hear. "Where's the baby? Another prop you've misplaced?" "She's home, asleep, where she belongs," I said. "I was invited here tonight. By the board." Sabrina appeared beside her mother, phone already raised out of habit, and then lowered it slowly when she registered who was standing beside me, Ambrose, and two other board members she clearly hadn't expected to see approach me directly. "Ren," Ambrose said, extending a hand. It was the first time he'd used my name in 3 years. "Thank you for coming tonight. How is Briar?" Rosalind's composure held for exactly as long as it took the Foundation's board chair to step up to the small stage and ask for everyone's attention. "Before we begin tonight's program," he said, "we have a brief announcement regarding leadership at Pemberton Shipping Group." He explained in careful, measured language that following a full review of the company's financial records, the board had voted, unanimously, with Ambrose Pemberton's support, to install Ren Castellan as acting CEO, effective immediately, pending a full audit of certain irregularities in the Foundation's subsidiary accounts. The room didn't gasp. It went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when everyone senses something has shifted and no one wants to be the first to react. Sabrina's face lost color. Rosalind's grip on her champagne glass tightened enough that her knuckles went pale. "This is absurd," Rosalind said, loud enough now that heads turned. "She's nobody. She has no experience running anything. She has an infant to worry about. She has majority ownership, and a daughter who is legally entitled to inherit this company one day," Ambrose said quietly, cutting her off for what may have been the first time in his life. "Sawyer made sure of both things months ago. I only found out myself last week." I stepped forward and spoke for the first time all evening, keeping my voice level, the way I'd practiced in Priya's office more times than I could count. "I'm not here to take anything that isn't already mine, or my daughter's," I said. "I'm here because my husband trusted me with something he didn't trust anyone else with, and because there are questions about where Foundation money has been going that deserve real answers." Sabrina's phone, for once, stayed in her purse. The audit took another 5 weeks to complete. What it found wasn't hidden particularly well. Sabrina had funneled just over $800,000 from a shipping subsidiary into a private venture under her name over 2 years, reporting it internally as consulting expenses that no consultant had ever been paid for. The board didn't involve outside authorities beyond what the company's own compliance policy required. Sabrina resigned from her position within the month, her name quietly removed from every Foundation event page it had once headlined. Rosalind stepped back from her role as Foundation director to focus on family matters, a phrase the local business paper printed without asking a single follow-up question. "I didn't gloat. I didn't post anything. I didn't need to. I kept the sapphire pendant. I kept the photo of Sawyer with a cracked glass, now reframed and sitting on my desk at the Pemberton Shipping Group offices, right beside a small framed picture of Briar on the day she was born. 6 months after Rosalind threw my suitcase into the mud and told my daughter and me we had nothing left, I sat in the office that used to be Sawyer's, signing my first set of company documents as CEO. Briar, now 6 months old, was already beginning to look more like Sawyer every day, and just as loud as he used to be at dinner. I think about that morning on the porch sometimes. The rain, the mud, the sound of her heels on the stone, Briar's small weight against my chest, the only steady thing in the world that day. Rosalind was right about one thing. We did walk away with nothing in our hands that morning. She just never stopped to ask what we were carrying that she couldn't see. If someone tried to convince you that you and your child had nothing left, right after you'd already lost everything else that mattered, would you have stayed quiet, or would you have proven them wrong the very first chance you got? Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Sophie Revenge for a new story every single day.